When I died at 28 from a car accident during that brutal Ohio blizzard, the last thing I remembered was gasping for air in my destroyed Honda Civic, my lungs still weak from the damage they'd suffered 12 years earlier. But when I opened my eyes again, I was back in my childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling that I hadn't seen since I was 16. The date on my phone read November 3rd, 2019. I could already feel that familiar tightness in my chest, that everyone in my family would dismiss as just another one of Sarah's little colds. Except this time, I knew the truth. This wasn't going to be just a cold. In exactly 8 days, I would be fighting for my life in the ICU at Riverside General Hospital, and my lungs filling with fluid while my family sat in the waiting room finally. Understanding that their tough-it-out philosophy had nearly killed their daughter, but this time, I had the advantage of knowing what was coming, and I wasn't going to let them ignore me into an early grave again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mitchell family home on Maple Street looked exactly the same as I remembered it from my previous life. Mom's coffee mug sat in the exact same spot on the kitchen counter, the one with the chipped handle that read "World's Most Organized Mom." Dad's insurance paperwork was scattered across the dining table in the same chaotic pattern that he somehow considered a filing system. Tyler's basketball trophies gleamed from every available surface in the living room, creating a shrine to our family's golden boy, who was currently in his sophomore year at the University of Cincinnati on a full athletic scholarship. The familiar sounds of our household filled the air. Tyler's voice boomed from the kitchen as he FaceTimed his girlfriend Ashley, bragging about his latest game statistics. Emma's paintbrush tapped rhythmically against her water jar as she worked on another one of her watercolor masterpieces at the breakfast bar. Mom's heels clicked across the hardwood floors as she rushed between rooms, juggling phone calls about some crisis at Riverside Elementary where she worked as vice principal. Dad's booming laugh echoed from his home office as he sealed another insurance deal, probably celebrating by loosening his tie and reaching for his third cup of coffee. And then there was me, Sarah Mitchell, the middle child, who had perfected the art of being invisible. In my previous life, I had thought this was just my natural personality, that I was simply the quiet, independent one who didn't need as much attention as my siblings. But with the wisdom of someone who had lived through this exact scenario before, I could see the truth with crystal clarity. I wasn't naturally invisible. I had been trained to be invisible, systematically taught that my needs were less important than everyone else's, that my voice mattered less than Tyler's booming confidence or Emma's artistic sensitivity. The cough started just like I remembered. It would, a small tickle in my throat during breakfast, easily dismissed as I reached for my orange juice. Mom barely glanced up from her phone where she was responding to urgent emails from the school district. Dad was too busy reviewing insurance claims to notice the slight rasp in my voice when I said, "Good morning." Tyler was describing his latest basketball triumph to Ashley through his phone screen, his voice drowning out any sound I might have made. Emma was lost in her own creative world, mixing colors with the intense focus that everyone in our family praised as artistic genius. "Sarah, honey, can you grab me my reading glasses from upstairs?" Mom called out without looking at me, already moving toward the door with her purse slung over her shoulder. "I'm running late for the school board meeting. Mrs. Peterson is going to have my head if I'm not there to defend the new disciplinary policies." I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling that familiar weight in my chest that I now recognized as the early stages of what would become a life-threatening infection. In my previous life, I had pushed through this feeling for days, telling myself it was nothing, that Mitchells were tough and didn't complain about every little ache and pain. Our family motto had been drilled into us since childhood: Mitchells. Our strong Mitchells don't quit, and Mitchells certainly don't run to the doctor for every sniffle. This philosophy had served Tyler well during his athletic career. He had played through sprained ankles, bruised ribs, and even a mild concussion that probably should have sidelined him for weeks. Dad bragged about Tyler's toughness to anyone who would listen, telling stories about how his son had finished entire games with injuries that would have sent other kids to the bench. Tyler wore these stories like badges of honor, and the rest of us were expected to live up to that same standard of unshakable resilience. Emma had never really been tested by this philosophy because she was still young and generally healthy. Plus, her artistic nature gave her a built-in excuse for sensitivity that Tyler and I didn't have. When Emma got upset about something, it was because she had an artist's soul and felt things more deeply than regular people. When she caught a cold, it was treated with extra care because we couldn't risk her missing art classes or competitions. But when I got sick, it was just Sarah being dramatic. Sarah needing attention. Sarah not living up to the Mitchell family standards of toughness. As I handed Mom her reading glasses, she was already halfway out the door. Her mind clearly focused on the challenges waiting for her at work. Thanks, sweetheart. There's leftover soup in the fridge if you want lunch later. Dad's got that big presentation with the Hartford Insurance Group this afternoon, so he'll probably be at the office until late. Tyler's got practice, and Emma's got art club after school. You're okay getting home by yourself, right? I nodded, even though she was already in her car by the time I responded. This was the pattern I remembered so well from my previous life. Everyone in the Mitchell family had important places to be, important people to see, important goals to achieve. Everyone except me. I was the reliable one, the low-maintenance one, the one who could always be counted on to figure things out. For herself, and not cause any problems for the rest of the family. Walking to Lincoln High School that morning, I felt the November cold seeping into my lungs in a way that was both familiar and terrifying. I knew exactly what was happening too. My body could practically chart the progression of the infection that was taking hold in my respiratory system. In my previous life, I had ignored these early warning signs, convincing myself that I was just being weak, that I needed to toughen up and stop looking for excuses to get attention. The high school hallways buzzed with their usual energy. Students clustered around lockers, discussing weekend plans and complaining about upcoming tests. My best friend Maya Rodriguez spotted me near my locker and immediately noticed something was off. Maya had always been more perceptive than most people, probably because she came from a large, noisy family, where paying attention to subtle changes in mood or health was a survival skill. "Sarah, you look terrible," Maya said bluntly, studying my face with the directness that made her such a good friend. "Are you getting sick? Your eyes look really glassy and you're paler than usual." In my previous life, I had brushed off Maya's concern, insisting I was fine and that she was overreacting. This time, I decided to be more honest, even though I knew it wouldn't change. What was coming? I think I might be coming down with something. My chest feels heavy, and I've got this cough that won't go away. Maya frowned, the kind of deep concern that showed she actually cared about my well-being. "Have you told your parents? Maybe you should go see the school nurse or something. Mrs. Walsh is really good about this stuff. And she'll know if you need to go home or see a doctor." Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, the school nurse, was someone I had completely overlooked in my previous life. Back then, I had been so conditioned to handle my own problems that it never occurred to me to seek help from the adults at school. But now, with the perspective of someone who had watched their family's neglect nearly kill them, I was beginning to understand that there were people outside the Mitchell household who might actually listen to me. "Maybe I'll stop by her office later," I told Maya, though I wasn't entirely sure what good it would do. In my previous life, the medical professionals in Riverside had been just as dismissive as my family. Dr. Patricia Hayes, our family physician, had been seeing the Mitchells for over a decade and had completely bought into our family's narrative, toughness and self-reliance. She was the kind of old-school doctor who believed that most childhood ailments could be cured with rest, fluids, and a positive attitude. The morning classes passed in a blur of half-listened lectures and growing discomfort. My chest felt tighter with each passing hour, and the cough that had started as a minor irritation was becoming more persistent and painful. By lunchtime, I was struggling to take deep breaths without triggering a coughing fit that left me exhausted and lightheaded. Maya sat with me in the cafeteria, watching with growing alarm as I picked at my food without eating much of anything. "Sarah, seriously, you look awful. Your lips are starting to look kind of blue, and you're breathing really weird. I think you need to go to the nurse right now." I looked down at my hands and saw that my fingernails did indeed have a slight, blue tinge that I recognized from my previous life as a sign that my blood wasn't getting enough oxygen. This was happening faster than I remembered, or maybe I was just more aware of the symptoms now that I knew what to look for. Either way, Maya was right. I needed to get to Mrs. Walsh's office before things got worse. The walk to the nurse's office felt longer than usual, and I had to stop twice to catch my breath in ways that made other students stare at me with curiosity and concern. When I finally knocked on Mrs. Walsh's door, she took one look at me and immediately guided me to the examination chair with the kind of professional urgency that told me she knew this was serious. Mrs. Walsh was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of competent, no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of dealing with teenage health crises. She had been a registered nurse at Riverside General Hospital before taking the school position, and unlike many school nurses who were primarily equipped to handle minor cuts and headaches, she had the experience to recognize when something was genuinely wrong. "Sarah, honey, how long have you been feeling sick?" she asked, while checking my temperature and pulse. Her hands were gentle but efficient, and I could see the concern growing in her eyes as she took my vital signs. "It started this morning with just a cough," I told her, "but it's getting worse really fast. My chest feels heavy and it's getting harder to breathe." Mrs. Walsh placed her stethoscope on my back and asked me to take deep breaths. I watched her face carefully as she listened, and I could see the exact moment when she heard what I knew. She would hear the crackling, wet sounds that indicated my lungs were beginning to fill with fluid. The sounds that meant this was definitely not just a cold. "Sarah, I'm going to be very direct with you," Mrs. Walsh said, removing the stethoscope and meeting my eyes with serious concern. "What I'm hearing in your lungs is not normal. You have significant congestion and what sounds like fluid buildup. Combined with your fever, rapid pulse, and the bluish tinge around your lips, I believe you may have pneumonia. This is not something you can tough out at home with over-the-counter medicine. You need to see a doctor immediately." The relief I felt at having an adult finally acknowledge that something was seriously wrong was almost overwhelming. In my previous life, it had taken 3 more days of worsening symptoms before anyone in my family had taken my condition seriously. Wow. And by then, I had been barely conscious and struggling to breathe. Mrs. Walsh was the first person in either timeline who had looked at me and seen a sick child who needed immediate medical attention rather than a teenager looking for attention or trying to get out of school. "I'm going to call your parents right now," Mrs. Walsh continued, reaching for her phone. "You need to get to the emergency room or at least see your family doctor this afternoon. This is not something we can treat here at school." I watched as Mrs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Walsh dialed my mother's work number, and I could predict exactly how this conversation was going to go. Mom would be in the middle of some school crisis, probably dealing with a disciplinary issue or a parent complaint. She would be stressed and distracted, and when Mrs. Walsh explained that I needed to see a doctor, Mom's first instinct would be to minimize the situation and look for ways to handle it without disrupting her busy schedule. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Jennifer Walsh, the nurse at Lincoln High School. I have Sarah here in my office, and I'm concerned about her breathing and some symptoms that suggest she may have pneumonia." There was a pause as Mrs. Walsh listened to my mother's response, and I could see her eyebrows furrow with what I recognized as professional frustration. "I understand that you're busy with school board issues, Mrs. Mitchell, but this really can't wait until evening. Sarah's oxygen levels are concerning, and she needs medical attention today." Another pause, longer this time, and I could practically hear my mother's voice through the phone, explaining how Sarah was probably just being dramatic, how Mitchells were tough and didn't run to the doctor for every little cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, with all due respect, I've been a nurse for over 20 years, and this is not a cold. I strongly recommend that you take Sarah to the emergency room, or at least to Dr. Hayes this afternoon. If you can't leave work, perhaps her father could pick her up." Mrs. Walsh's voice was becoming more firm, the tone of a medical professional who was not going to be dismissed by a parent's convenience. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Walsh patiently but persistently explaining why this couldn't wait until the weekend. Why I couldn't just go home and rest it off. Why this was a genuine medical emergency that required immediate attention. I could tell from Mrs. Walsh's side of the conversation that my mother was pushing back, probably suggesting that I stay in the nurse's office for the rest of the day, or that I go home and see how I felt after a good night's sleep. Finally, Mrs. Walsh hung up the phone and turned back to me with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal frustration. "Your mother is going to try to leave work early to take you to Dr. Hayes's office. She said it might be a couple of hours, but she'll call the doctor's office to see if they can fit you in this afternoon." I knew from my previous life exactly what would happen next. Mom would get caught up in another work crisis, wouldn't be able to leave until much later than planned. Dr. Hayes's office would be booked solid. The earliest appointment they could offer would be the next morning. By the time I actually saw a doctor, my condition would have deteriorated significantly. And what could have been treated with antibiotics and rest would have become a life-threatening emergency, requiring intensive care. But this time, I had the advantage of knowing what was coming, and I was determined not to let the same pattern of neglect play out again. I was going to have to advocate for myself in ways that my previous 16-year-old self had never learned to do, and I was going to have to convince the adults around me that this situation was more serious than they wanted to believe. Why? Sat in Mrs. Walsh's office, feeling my breathing become more labored with each passing minute. I began to formulate a plan that would ensure I got the medical attention I needed before it was too late. This time, I wasn't going to let my family's philosophy of toughness and self-reliance nearly kill me. This time, I was going to fight for my own life. The hours that followed in Mrs. Walsh's office felt like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold exactly as I remembered it. Every 20 minutes, she would check my vital signs again, and each time her frown deepened as my condition steadily worsened. My temperature had climbed to 102.8 degrees. My breathing had become increasingly shallow and rapid, and the blue tinge around my lips was becoming more pronounced despite her efforts to keep me sitting upright and comfortable. At 3:30, Mrs. Walsh called my mother's office again, only to be told by the secretary that Mrs. Mitchell was in an emergency meeting with the superintendent about a potential lawsuit from a parent whose child had been suspended for bringing a weapon to school. The meeting could last until 6 o'clock or later, and no, Linda Mitchell could not be interrupted unless someone was literally dying. Mrs. Walsh hung up the phone with barely contained frustration and immediately dialed my father's insurance office. I listened as she explained the situation to Dad's secretary, Mrs. Coleman, who had been with the agency for 15 years and knew our family well. Through the phone, I could hear Mrs. Coleman's apologetic voice explaining that Mr. Mitchell was at the Hartford Insurance Group's regional headquarters for the biggest presentation of his career, one that could potentially bring in millions of dollars in new business for their small agency. "I understand this is important for Mr. Mitchell's business," Mrs. Walsh said with the patient but firm tone of someone who dealt with difficult parents regularly. "But Sarah's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Her oxygen saturation is dropping, and she's showing signs of respiratory distress. If neither parent can come immediately, I'm going to have to call an ambulance." The mention of an ambulance seemed to get Mrs. Coleman's attention, and I could hear her promising to try to reach my father between presentation segments. Mrs. Walsh thanked her and hung up, then turned to me with the kind of gentle but serious expression that I now recognized as someone preparing to make a difficult decision on behalf of a child whose parents were too busy to protect her. "Sarah, honey, I want you to listen to me very carefully," she said, pulling her chair closer to mine. "Your condition is getting worse, not better, and waiting for your parents could be dangerous. I have the authority to call emergency services if I believe a student is in immediate medical danger. And that's exactly what I'm prepared to do if your parents don't respond within the next hour. In my previous life, this is when I had begged Mrs. Walsh not to call an ambulance, terrified of the trouble I would get into with my parents for causing such a dramatic scene. I had been so conditioned to minimize my own needs and avoid inconveniencing my family that I had actually argued against getting the medical care that could have saved me from days of suffering. This time, I looked Mrs. Walsh directly in the eyes and said something that shocked both of us. "Please call the ambulance now. I can't breathe properly, and I'm scared that if we wait any longer, I might not make it." Mrs. Walsh's eyes widened slightly at my directness, but I could see relief flooding her face as well. She had been a medical professional long enough to recognize when a patient was in serious trouble, and she had probably been fighting her own instincts to call emergency services immediately, rather than trying to accommodate my parents' schedules. "You're absolutely right, Sarah. I'm calling 911 right now." She reached for her phone with the decisive movement of someone who had finally been given permission to do what she knew was medically necessary. While Mrs. Walsh spoke to the emergency dispatcher, providing them with my symptoms and vital signs, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror wash over me. Relief, because I knew I was finally going to get the medical attention I desperately needed, and terror, because I was about to set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family forever. In my previous life, the ambulance ride to Riverside General Hospital had been a blur of oxygen masks, concerned paramedics, and growing panic as my breathing became more labored. This time, I was conscious and aware enough to appreciate the professionalism of the EMT team that responded to Mrs. Walsh's call. The lead paramedic, a woman named Janet, who looked to be in her 40s, took one look at me and immediately understood the severity of the situation. "How long has she been having trouble breathing?" Janet asked Mrs. Walsh while her partner began setting up oxygen equipment. "She came to my office around noon with what she said started as a cough this morning," Mrs. Walsh replied, handing over the notes she had been taking throughout the afternoon. "Her condition has deteriorated rapidly. Temperature is 103.1, pulse is 120, respirations are 28 and shallow, and her oxygen saturation has dropped to 88%. Janet's expression grew serious as she listened to my lungs with her stethoscope. "Classic signs of pneumonia, possibly severe. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." She turned to me with the kind of calm, reassuring manner that good emergency responders develop. "Sarah, we're going to take excellent care of you, okay? You did the right thing by getting help when you did." The ambulance ride passed quickly, with Janet monitoring my breathing and adjusting the oxygen flow to keep me comfortable. She asked me questions about my symptoms and medical history, and I found myself able to provide much more detailed and useful information than I had in my previous life. I told her about the rapid progression of the cough, the chest pain that was getting worse, and the way my breathing had become increasingly difficult throughout the day. "Have you had pneumonia before?" Janet asked, checking my blood pressure for the third time during the short trip. "No, but I know this is serious," I replied, my voice slightly muffled by the oxygen mask. "My family doesn't really believe in going to the doctor unless it's an emergency, but I could tell this wasn't just a regular cold." Janet nodded approvingly. "You were smart to listen to your body and get help. A lot of people, especially teenagers, try to tough out pneumonia, and that can be really dangerous. Pneumonia can go from manageable to life-threatening very quickly if it's not treated properly." As we pulled up to the emergency entrance of Riverside General Hospital, I could see Mrs. Walsh's car in the parking lot, where she had followed the ambulance to make sure I wasn't alone when my parents finally arrived. This small act of kindness meant more to me than she could possibly know, especially since I remembered how isolated and scared I had felt during my previous hospital stay. The emergency room at Riverside General was exactly as I remembered it. Busy, slightly chaotic, but staffed with competent medical professionals who knew how to prioritize serious cases. Janet wheeled me directly to a treatment room where a doctor was already waiting, having been briefed by the ambulance crew during our transport. Dr. Marcus Chen was a man in his late 30s with the kind of calm, methodical demeanor that inspired confidence even in crisis situations. He had been working in emergency medicine for over a decade, and I could tell immediately that he was the kind of doctor who took every case seriously and didn't make assumptions based on a patient's age or family dynamics. "Sarah, I'm Dr. Chen, and I'm going to take excellent care of you today," he said, while washing his hands and reviewing the notes that Janet had provided. "The paramedics tell me you've been having breathing problems and chest pain. Can you tell me in your own words how you've been feeling?" I described my symptoms as clearly and completely as I could, including details about the rapid progression and the way my breathing had become increasingly labored throughout the day. Dr. Chen listened attentively, asking follow-up questions that showed he was taking my concerns seriously and building a complete picture of my condition. "I'm going to listen to your lungs now," he said, warming his stethoscope with his hands before placing it on my back. "Take the deepest breaths you can for me." I watched Dr. Chen's face as he listened, and I could see the moment when he heard the same concerning sounds that Mrs. Walsh had detected earlier in the day. His expression grew more serious, and he moved the stethoscope to several different positions on my chest and back, clearly hearing things that confirmed his initial suspicions. "Sarah, based on what I'm hearing and your symptoms, I believe you have bacterial pneumonia, which is a serious infection in your lungs." Dr. Chen explained in terms that were clear but not condescending. "We're going to need to do a chest x-ray to confirm the diagnosis and see how extensive the infection is. We'll also need to run some blood tests to check your white blood cell count and other markers." As if on cue, my mother burst through the emergency room doors, still wearing her work clothes and carrying the frazzled energy of someone who had rushed across town in heavy traffic. She spotted Mrs. Walsh in the waiting area and hurried over, her face a mixture of worry and the kind of defensive irritation that I knew meant she was preparing to downplay the situation. "Jennifer, what on earth happened? I got your message about Sarah needing to go to the hospital, but surely this could have waited until I could pick her up after work. Now I've had to leave the superintendent's meeting right in the middle of a crisis. And I don't understand why we couldn't have just made an appointment with Dr. Hayes for tomorrow morning." Mrs. Walsh's response was diplomatic but firm. "Linda, Sarah's condition deteriorated very rapidly this afternoon. Her breathing became increasingly labored. Her fever spiked to over 103, and she was showing signs of oxygen deprivation. The paramedics confirmed that this was a medical emergency that required immediate attention. Before my mother could respond, with what I knew would be a series of objections and minimizations, Dr. Chen appeared in the waiting area with a kind of serious expression that immediately commanded attention. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Chen, and I've been examining your daughter. Could I speak with you privately about her condition?" Mom followed Dr. Chen to a quieter area of the emergency room, and I watched through the glass window as he explained my diagnosis and treatment plan. I could see Mom's body language shift from defensive irritation to genuine concern as Dr. Chen showed her the chest X-ray images on his tablet and pointed out the areas of infection in my lungs. When they returned to my treatment room, the entire demeanor had changed. The frazzled work stress had been replaced by the focused attention of a parent who had finally understood that her child was seriously ill. She sat down next to my bed and took my hand with a gentleness that I hadn't experienced from her in years. "Sarah, honey, Dr. Chen says you have pneumonia in both lungs, and it's pretty severe," she said, her voice carrying the kind of maternal concern that I had forgotten she was capable of. "He wants to admit you to the hospital for a few days so they can give you IV antibiotics and monitor your breathing." Dr. Chen nodded, addressing both of us as he explained the treatment plan. "The infection is quite extensive, and Sarah's oxygen levels have been dangerously low. We're going to start her on VA antibiotics immediately. She'll need supplemental oxygen for at least the next 24 hours. Most patients with pneumonia this severe require 3 to 5 days of hospitalization to ensure the infection responds properly to treatment." As the nurses began preparing me for admission, Dad arrived at the hospital looking harried and confused. His big presentation had been interrupted by Mrs. Coleman's urgent message, and he had driven straight from Hartford without fully understanding what was happening. When Dr. Chen repeated the diagnosis and treatment plan for Dad's benefit, I watched my father's face go through the same transformation that Mom's had experienced. Pneumonia? But this morning, she just had a little cough, Dad said, clearly struggling to understand how things had escalated so quickly. "Are you sure it's not just a bad cold, or maybe bronchitis?" X-ray on the room's computer monitor and pointed to the cloudy areas that indicated infection. "Mr. Mitchell, this is definitely bacterial pneumonia, and it's quite severe. You can see here how the infection has spread throughout both lungs. If Sarah hadn't gotten medical attention when she did, this could have become life-threatening." The weight of those words settled over my parents like a cold blanket. I could see them both processing the reality that their tough-it-out philosophy had nearly resulted in a medical emergency that could have killed their. Mom squeezed my hand tighter, and Dad moved closer to my bed with the kind of protective stance that I hadn't seen from him since I was a small child. Tyler arrived at the hospital an hour later, having driven straight from basketball practice. After receiving a frantic call from Mom, his usual, confident swagger was completely absent as he entered my room, replaced by the wide-eyed concern of someone who had never seen his sister seriously ill before. Emma came with him, her art supplies still tucked under her arm from after-school club, her young face pale with worry. "Sarah, are you okay?" Tyler asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Mom said, you have pneumonia. That's really serious, isn't it?" For the first time in either of my lives, I had Tyler's complete, undivided attention. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't thinking about his next game or practice, wasn't preoccupied with Ashley or his college plans. He was focused entirely on me, his little sister, who was lying in a hospital bed with oxygen tubes in her nose and IV lines in her arm. "It is serious," I told him honestly. Dr. Chen said if I hadn't gotten help when I did, it could have been life-threatening. Emma climbed carefully onto the edge of my hospital bed, her artistic sensitivity making her acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. "I was scared when Mom called," she said softly. "I've never seen you this sick before." As my family gathered around my hospital bed for the first time in years, I realized that this medical crisis was accomplishing something that no amount of arguing or pleading had ever achieved. It was forcing them to see me as a person whose health and well-being mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard, whose needs were worthy of their time and attention. The next 3 days in the hospital passed in a blur of 4 antibiotics, breathing treatments, and gradual improvement. Dr. Chen and the nursing staff monitored my progress carefully, adjusting my treatment as my lungs slowly cleared and my breathing returned to normal. But more importantly, those 3 days marked a fundamental shift in my family's understanding of who I was and what I meant to them. Mom took time off from work to stay with me during the day, something she had never done before for any of my illnesses or injuries. She brought magazines and puzzle books, helped me with homework that Maya had collected from my teachers, and actually listened when I talked about my classes, my friends, and my thoughts about the future. For the first time in years, I had her complete attention without having to compete with work crises or Tyler's athletic achievements. Dad visited every evening after work, bringing updates about his insurance clients and asking detailed questions about my treatment and recovery. He spoke with Dr. Chen extensively about my diagnosis and care plan, showing the kind of engaged parental concern that he usually reserved for Tyler's sports medicine appointments. When Dr. Chen mentioned that pneumonia could sometimes have long-term effects on lung function, Dad immediately asked about follow-up care and preventive measures to ensure my complete recovery. Tyler surprised me the most during those hospital days. He visited every afternoon after practice, bringing homework assignments and gossip from school, but more importantly, he actually asked about my experiences and opinions on things that had nothing to do with basketball or athletics. He told me about problems he was having with certain classes, asked for my advice about dealing with difficult professors, and even admitted that he sometimes felt overwhelmed by the pressure to maintain his athletic scholarship. Emma spent hours at my bedside drawing pictures of our family. But for the first time, I was prominently featured in every drawing rather than being a small figure in the background. She drew me as a brave hospital patient surrounded by doctors and nurses who cared about making me better, and she drew our family gathered around my bed looking worried and attentive. These drawings captured a version of our family dynamics that had never existed before, but that was beginning to emerge from this crisis. On my 3rd day in the hospital, Mrs. Walsh came to visit during her lunch break, bringing get-well cards from my classmates and a small potted plant for my room. She sat with me for nearly an hour, and we talked about my plans for when I returned to school and my thoughts about future career possibilities. "You handled this medical crisis with remarkable maturity and self-advocacy. You recognized that something was seriously wrong. You asked for help when you needed it, and you communicated clearly with the medical staff about your symptoms. Those are valuable skills that will serve you well throughout your life." Words carried special meaning because I knew how different my behavior had been compared to my previous life. This time, I had trusted my own instincts about my health. I had been willing to inconvenience my family to get medical attention. And I had advocated for myself in ways that my younger self had never learned to do. When Dr. Chen finally cleared me for discharge, he spent considerable time with my parents, reviewing my recovery plan and emphasizing the importance of taking my health concerns seriously in the future. Pneumonia can recur, especially in patients who have had severe cases like Sarah's, he explained. It's crucial that any respiratory symptoms be evaluated promptly, rather than waiting to see if they resolve on their own. Dad nodded seriously, taking notes in a small notebook that he usually reserved for important insurance client information. So if she gets a cough or starts having breathing problems again, we should bring her in right away rather than trying to treat it at home. Absolutely, Dr. Chen confirmed. Sarah's pneumonia progressed very rapidly from early symptoms to severe illness. In cases like this, early intervention can mean the difference between outpatient treatment with oral antibiotics and hospitalization with IV therapy. Mom asked detailed questions about warning signs to watch for, follow-up, appointments with our family doctor, and steps we could take to support my complete recovery. This level of parental engagement with my medical care was completely unprecedented in my experience, and I could see that it was making a strong impression on Dr. Chen as well. As we prepared to leave the hospital, I realized that this medical crisis had accomplished something that years of trying to prove myself worthy of my family's attention had never achieved. It had forced them to confront the reality that I was a person whose health and well-being mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard, and whose needs were worthy of their time and concern. The drive home from the hospital was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than I was used to from my family. Instead of everyone being absorbed in their own thoughts and preoccupations, there was a sense of shared concern and relief. Mom kept turning around to check on me in the back seat. Dad drove more carefully than usual. Tyler actually put away his phone to focus on our conversation about my recovery plan. When we arrived home, I discovered that Emma had rearranged my bedroom to make it more comfortable for my recovery. She had moved my bed closer to the window so I could get more natural light, organized my books and school supplies within easy reach, and created a small art station where she could work on projects while keeping me company during my recuperation. As I settled into my newly arranged room, surrounded by get-well cards from classmates, flowers from neighbors, and the genuine concern of family members who had finally learned to see me as someone worthy of their attention and care, I felt a sense of peace and validation that I had never experienced in my previous life. The pneumonia that had nearly killed me had also saved me in ways that I was only beginning to understand. It had taught my family that ignoring health concerns and expecting everyone to tough it out could have devastating consequences. It had shown them that I was capable of mature judgment and self-advocacy when my well-being was at stake. Most importantly, it had forced them to confront the reality that their middle daughter was not the low-maintenance, invisible child they had assumed me to be, but rather a person with her own needs, concerns, and valuable contributions to make to our family. As I drifted off to sleep that first night home from the hospital, breathing easily for the first time in over a week, I knew that this medical crisis had changed our family dynamics forever. I had nearly died from pneumonia that my family had initially dismissed as just a cold, but in surviving it, I had finally found my voice and my place in the Mitchell family. The tough-it-out philosophy that had nearly cost me my life had been replaced by a new understanding that health concerns should be taken seriously, that my voice mattered, and that advocating for myself was not selfish but necessary. The girl, who had died alone in a car accident at 28, still suffering from lung damage caused by untreated childhood pneumonia, had been given a second chance to rewrite her story. This time, I had chosen to fight for my own life and demand the medical attention I deserved. This time, my family had learned that love sometimes means taking symptoms seriously rather than expecting everyone to suffer in silence. This time, I had discovered that my voice was strong enough to save my own life. 6 months after my discharge from Riverside General Hospital, the Mitchell family had transformed into something I barely recognized from either of my lifetimes. The kitchen table that had once been dominated by Dad's insurance paperwork and Tyler's athletic achievements now featured a weekly family calendar, where everyone's activities were equally represented and discussed. Mom had instituted regular family dinners where phones were banned and actual conversations took place. Dad had started asking detailed questions about my classes and future plans with the same intensity he had previously reserved for Tyler's basketball statistics. The most dramatic change came when Tyler tore his ACL during a particularly aggressive game in February. In my previous life, this injury had devastated our entire family. With Mom and Dad spending thousands of dollars on specialists and experimental treatments while Tyler fell into a deep depression about his potentially ruined athletic career. This time, however, the family's response was remarkably different. While they were certainly concerned and supportive, they didn't treat Tyler's injury as a family-ending catastrophe. Instead, Mom and Dad approached Tyler's recovery with the same methodical attention to medical care that they had learned during my pneumonia crisis. They scheduled appointments with orthopedic specialists, physical therapists, and sports medicine doctors. But they also encouraged Tyler to think about backup plans and alternative goals that didn't revolve entirely around basketball. For the first time in his life, Tyler was forced to consider his identity beyond athletics, and surprisingly, he handled this challenge with more maturity than anyone expected. During Tyler's recovery period, he spent considerable time at home, and we developed a relationship that had never existed in my previous life. Without the constant pressure of practices, games, and athletic achievements dominating his schedule, Tyler revealed himself to be thoughtful, curious about academic subjects, and genuinely interested in other people's experiences. He asked me about my classes, my friends, and my thoughts about college and career plans, with a sincerity that showed he was learning to see me as a complete person, rather than just his low-maintenance little sister. One evening in March, as Tyler was doing his physical therapy exercises in the living room while I worked on calculus homework nearby, he brought up something that had been bothering him since my hospitalization. "Sarah, can I ask you something that might sound weird?" he said, pausing, his leg stretches to look at me directly. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I replied, setting down my pencil to give him my full attention. "When you were in the hospital with pneumonia, you seemed different somehow. Like you knew exactly what questions to ask the doctors. And you explained your symptoms really clearly. You weren't scared in the way I would have expected a 16-year-old to be. It was almost like you had been through something like that before." Tyler's observation was more perceptive than I had given him credit for. And I realized that my adult perspective from my previous life might have been more obvious than I thought. I considered how to respond without revealing the truth about my rebirth experience. "I think almost dying makes you grow up fast," I said carefully. "When you're struggling to breathe and you realize that your life might actually be in danger, you learn pretty quickly to advocate for yourself and pay attention to what's happening with your body." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I guess I never really understood how serious it was until I saw you in that hospital bed with all those machines. It made me realize that all the times I called you dramatic for complaining about being sick, I was probably being a real jerk. I'm sorry about that." This apology meant more to me than Tyler could possibly know because it represented the kind of genuine acknowledgement and accountability that had never existed in my previous life. The old Tyler would never have admitted to being wrong about anything, especially not to his younger sister. But this medical crisis had taught him, along with the rest of our family, that dismissing someone's health concerns could have serious consequences. Emma's artistic development had also taken an interesting turn following my hospitalization. She had become fascinated with medical illustration and had started creating detailed drawings of human anatomy, particularly respiratory systems. Her art teacher at school was so impressed with this new direction that she arranged for Emma to visit the medical illustration department at the University of Cincinnati's medical school, where she got to meet professional medical artists and learn about career possibilities in the field. This new interest led to Emma spending more time with me, asking questions about my hospital experience and wanting to understand the medical aspects of my treatment. She created a detailed illustrated journal documenting my recovery process, complete with anatomically accurate drawings of healthy versus infected lungs, explanations of how antibiotics work, and timelines showing the progression of pneumonia symptoms. Her artistic talent combined with scientific curiosity created work that was genuinely impressive for a 13-year-old. Mom's transformation was perhaps the most profound of all. The woman who had once been too busy with work crises to notice her daughter's serious illness had become almost hypervigilant about health issues in our household. She had established relationships with specialists in various medical fields, created detailed medical history files for each family member, and even took a first aid certification course at the local community college. More importantly, Mom had recognized that her previous approach to parenting had been dangerously unbalanced. She arranged for family counseling sessions to help us all communicate better, and to address the patterns of favoritism and neglect that had characterized our household dynamics for years. During these sessions, she admitted that she had been so focused on Tyler's visible achievements and Emma's obvious artistic talent that she had essentially ignored me, assuming I was fine because I didn't demand attention the way my siblings. Did I realize now that I mistook Sarah's independence and maturity for not needing parental support and attention? Mom explained during one of our family counseling sessions. I thought she was just naturally self-sufficient, but what I was really seeing was a child who had learned not to ask for help because she didn't believe anyone would listen. Dad's evolution was equally significant, but manifested differently. He had always been a practical man who approached problems systematically, and he applied this same methodical thinking to understanding what had gone wrong during my pneumonia crisis. He spent hours researching pediatric health issues, symptoms that parents commonly dismiss, and statistics about medical emergencies in teenagers. What he discovered horrified him. According to his research, delayed medical treatment for pneumonia in adolescence was surprisingly common, often because parents and even medical professionals tended to assume that young people were exaggerating their symptoms or seeking attention. Dad learned that pneumonia could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening illness in a matter of hours, especially in cases where the patient had been trying to tough it out instead of resting and seeking medical care. Armed with this knowledge, Dad became an advocate for taking health concerns seriously, not just in our family, but in his broader community. He started including health insurance education in his client consultations, helping families understand the importance of preventive care and early medical intervention. He also became involved with the school district's Health and Safety Committee, pushing for better training for school nurses and clearer protocols for handling medical emergencies. The changes in our family dynamics had ripple effects that extended far beyond our household. Maya Rodriguez, my best friend, who had been the first person to recognize that I was seriously ill, became something of a family friend, as my parents expressed their gratitude for her observation and concern. Maya's own parents, who were both nurses, were impressed with how the Mitchell family had learned from their mistakes and changed their approach to health and medical care. Mrs. Walsh, the school nurse who had literally saved my life by calling an ambulance despite my parents' initial resistance, was invited to our house for dinner on multiple occasions. Mom and Dad wanted to thank her personally for her professional judgment and advocacy, and they also wanted to learn from her experience about recognizing medical emergencies in young people. Mrs. Walsh became an informal consultant to our family, helping us understand when symptoms warranted medical attention and when they could be safely managed at home. As my senior year of high school approached, the conversations about college and career plans in our household were dramatically different from what I remembered from my previous life. Instead of being an afterthought whose educational plans received minimal attention and financial support, I found myself at the center of detailed discussions about universities, majors, and professional possibilities. Dad had started a college savings account specifically for my education, something that had never existed in my previous life when the family's resources were primarily devoted to supporting Tyler's athletic career. Mom was researching scholarship opportunities and talking to guidance counselors about programs that would be good fits for my academic interests and career goals. Even Tyler was contributing to these conversations, sharing insights from his own college experience and offering to introduce me to professors and students in fields that interested me. The subject of my career interests led to some of the most meaningful conversations I had ever had with my family. My experience with pneumonia and the medical professionals who had saved my life had sparked a genuine interest in healthcare, particularly in emergency medicine and patient advocacy. I talked about wanting to become a doctor or nurse practitioner, with a focus on helping patients who might not be taken seriously by medical professionals or family members. And Mom was immediately supportive of this goal, recognizing the irony that my experience of being medically neglected had inspired me too. prevent the same thing from happening to other patients. She arranged for me to volunteer at Riverside General Hospital, where I could observe medical professionals in action and learn more about healthcare careers. Dr. Chen, who had treated me during my pneumonia crisis, became an informal mentor, answering my questions about medical school and introducing me to other healthcare professionals who could provide guidance about different career paths. Dad approached my medical career interests with his characteristic systematic thinking, researching the financial requirements for medical school, the competitiveness of different programs, and the long-term earning potential of various medical specialties. But more importantly, he expressed genuine pride in my goal of becoming a healthcare provider, something that had never happened in my previous life when my interests and achievements were consistently overshadowed by Tyler's athletic success. Tyler's response to my medical career plans was perhaps the most surprising of all. During his recovery from ACL surgery, he had spent considerable time in physical therapy and sports medicine clinics, where he had observed the dedication and skill of healthcare professionals. He told me that watching these professionals work had given him new respect for medical careers and that he thought I would be excellent in a field that required both scientific knowledge and patient advocacy skills. Emma's support for my medical interests took a characteristically artistic form. She created a series of drawings depicting me in various healthcare scenarios, as a doctor examining patients, as a nurse providing comfort to families, as a medical researcher making important discoveries. These drawings were not just supportive gestures for my little sister, but genuine, artistic interpretations of my potential future that she displayed proudly in her room and shared with her art teachers and classmates. As spring turned to summer and my senior year approached, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that November day when I had been reborn into my 16-year-old body with the memories and wisdom of my previous 28 years. The pneumonia that had nearly killed me had ultimately saved me in ways that went far beyond the immediate medical treatment. The crisis had forced my family to confront their patterns of neglect and favoritism, leading to genuine changes in how they treated me and each other. It had taught me to advocate for myself and trust my own instincts about my health and well-being. Most importantly, it had shown all of us that love sometimes means taking concerns seriously rather than expecting people to suffer in silence. During my previous life, I had spent years trying to prove myself worthy of my family's attention and support, competing unsuccessfully with Tyler's athletic achievements and Emma's artistic talent for recognition and resources. This time, I had learned that my worth wasn't dependent on outdoing my siblings or meeting some impossible standard of achievement. Instead, my worth was inherent in my existence as a person with my own needs, interests, and contributions to make to our family and community. The medical neglect that had characterized my previous relationship with my family had been replaced by genuine concern and support for my health and well-being. The dismissive attitude toward my voice and opinions had evolved into active listening and engagement with my thoughts and plans. The financial favoritism that had previously directed all family resources toward Tyler's athletic career had been replaced by equitable support for all three children's educational and personal development goals. As I prepared to apply to colleges with strong pre-medical programs, knowing that I had my family's full emotional and financial support, I realized that this second chance at life had given me something far more valuable than just the opportunity to avoid a medical emergency. It had given me the chance to be seen, heard, and valued by the people who mattered most to me. The girl who had died alone in a car accident, still suffering from lung damage caused by childhood pneumonia that had been inadequately treated, had been replaced by a young woman with a clear sense of purpose and the full support of a family, who had learned to prioritize what truly mattered. The tough-it-out philosophy that had nearly cost me my life had been replaced by a new understanding that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. My journey from medical neglect to genuine family support had taught me that sometimes the most devastating crises can become the catalyst for the most positive changes. The pneumonia that my family had initially dismissed as just a cold had become the wake-up call that transformed our relationships and set me on a path toward a career dedicated to preventing other patients from experiencing the same neglect I had endured. As I looked toward my future in healthcare, I knew that my personal experience of nearly dying from an illness that was initially dismissed would make me a better doctor and a stronger advocate for patients whose concerns might not be taken seriously. The second chance at life that I had been given through my rebirth had taught me that every voice matters. Every symptom deserves attention, and every person has the right to be heard and cared for by the people who love them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.